All right, next up, we are talking about the textbook, Chapter 6, DQM, interviewing, and this will be part one of two to go over key concepts from the chapter. Okay, so as the authors explain on page 119, interviewing can be used by itself or with ethnography, and both are very common to just do an interview study or to do it with a multi-method, including ethnography. On 119, they also refer to to interviews as a special kind of conversation. Ideally, it should flow back and forth, but there are some real expectations for research interviews that differ from journalism interviews. For those of you who are comm majors who've had Comm 40 Introduction to Journalism, there are similarities in terms of establishing rapport and getting people to talk to you and to be open with you, but there are real differences in terms of the purpose and the ways in which we ask and think about the information that we get. Okay, they sometimes refer to these as in-depth or intensive interviews, but we're just going to call them interviews or qualitative interviews. Okay, on 120, they describe interviews, right? And that there are these active components, and the goal is to get accounts or information and ideas and descriptions and stories from people. These interviews are usually a single event, but sometimes they're done in a series if somebody is able to get access to children, for example, at different ages, and they might ask them questions about how they feel about their bodies at age 6, and then at age 10, and then at age 14, right, to get a sense of how they age, whether that shapes things, or sometimes they want to understand how people change their ideas about an organization after they've been part of it for a period of time. So maybe when they're first hired at a company and how they feel 6 months later and a year later and 2 years later, that kind of thing. So sometimes they do interviews in series, but most of the time, just one. Like ethnography, the origins of doing interview research, this kind of qualitative research, are also in social reform, trying to understand poverty and inequality, trying to understand people's access to reproductive knowledge, and particularly earlier when widespread understanding of how reproduction worked was not shared and was particularly difficult in different um, class and racial and socioeconomic groups. Okay, on 122, they talk about why we would use ethnography methods or we would use interviewing. And basically, the idea is that ethnography gives you the interactions when you're watching people, their behavior, and even if you're participating with them, the idea is to see how they work or how they practice on a sports team or how they act as part of an organization such as a fraternity or sorority or an organization such as SCAP, right? Other organizations on campus. So if you want to know how the behavior and the interactions go, you're going to want to be part of that, watching and participating in them, in the interactions. Interviews, on the other hand, give you a good sense of what your text calls biography and accounts, meaning learning about their background, who they are, where they come from, and accounts, meaning the account that they give it. This does not We're not objective either, right? So this is our intersubjective meanings that we co-construct with our participant, and they tell an account of themselves or an account of an incident, of their thoughts and feelings. The idea is to get descriptions and stories and ways of understanding their meanings that the participants can describe for you as well. They draw a distinction here between conversations you'd have in the field as an ethnographer, which are often referred to as ethnographic interviews. They are casual. I'm following a nurse around, and when he does something, I then ask him a question about why he did that or what it means to him or what he's going to do next, right? Or maybe when there's some downtime and I'm sitting at the nurse's station, I chat with some of the nurses about what they do on the weekends or how they maybe about their children, about being a working parent, those kinds of things. So those are what are called ethnographic interviews or conversations in the field. And those are quite different from a research interview, which is set up on purpose ahead of time and involves having a prepared set of questions. And again, you might do these both together, so you get different things from either one, and then if you do them both, then you get the ability to put the interactions together with the interviews. And your goal is not to say, hey, I watched you, and what I saw you doing or what I understood you as behaving in a particular way in a particular context doesn't match what you say, right? There's what you say that you do or the way you say you understand things. Our goal is not to try to catch people and say, haha, you were right. You were wrong. You said that you always give your kids a healthy breakfast, but I watched you for 10 mornings, and on 2 of those mornings, you gave your kids a donut, right? The point is to get how they understand their lives, and if they understand being a good parent means that 8 times out of 10 the kid gets cereal and fruit, and 2 times out of 10 they get a donut, then that's up to them, right? That's how they understand things. Same thing with how they think that they communicate, how doctors think they communicate with patients, or how athletes think they communicate with coaches, whatever it is you might be studying. Okay, and then on 122, they also specify that when you're doing research, you form a research question or a set of questions on your topic. And I just want to explain broadly that that means the question that you're trying to answer with your study. It's what we have in qualitative research instead of a hypothesis. A hypothesis, remember we talked about positivism and quantitative research, a hypothesis is an educated guess. I think the world is going to be like this, right? I think this is how students will behave, or this is how they will report on their lives. And with that kind of positivist research and that best educated guess, that guess comes from a theory that predicts behavior will be certain ways or that attitudes will be certain ways, and there's reasons why that theory sets the view of the world up that way, and then that's where the guess comes. We don't have that. So in qualitative research, with the intersubjective approach, right, which we call social constructionism, we make meaning together, neither subjective nor objective, but intersubjective, right? When we make meaning together in qualitative research, we do that using a research question. Or sometimes a small set of research questions. Now, I'm differentiating here from interview questions because that'll be my next topic, okay? So I want you to understand that interview questions are the specific questions that you ask in an interview, but that the whole study, whether it's just interviews or it's interviews in ethnography or other kinds of data, involves a research question that is the guide work or the framework, and then interview questions. Okay. Before we get on to specifics about interview questions, I want to talk to you a little bit about the idea of open and closed questions. Again, those of you who've had intro to journalism learned that open questions are ones that can be answered by the participant in a lot of ways. It gives them a lot of freedom to decide where to go. They have more control on how to answer. Whereas a closed question is either a yes or no question, right? Are you a professor? That's a yes or no question. Or how old are you? Right? That's not a yes or no question. The answer is 26 or 51 or whatever, but the answer is a very specific piece of information, and you're not inviting the person to elaborate on it in the way that they want to elaborate on it. Now, there's a list of questions, not all of which I think are great open questions, but I particularly want to draw your attention to the last question, which is what we call a clearinghouse question. It's what you ask at the end of an interview. And the example they give you is there anything else you'd like to add, which is a terrible, terrible question. And if I ask you for an open question and you put this down on an exam, it will be considered wrong because is there anything else you'd like to add is a yes or no question. Is there or isn't there, right? Yes or no. And the problem, of course, with this question, and I say this as a person who has conducted dozens and dozens of interviews, is that the answer will always be no. Don't ask them if there is something. Ask them instead, what else have we not discussed that you think would be helpful for me to know? Or what else do you think I need to know in order to understand this topic, right? The point is to assume, to communicate to them that I'm assuming that you will have some more knowledge that I haven't thought to ask you about. Never give them a way out of it by saying, is there something? Because they will almost always say no. Okay. Now we're going to talk some more about the questions themselves that you're going to ask in an interview. And remember, we're calling these interview questions as opposed to research questions, which are the guide or the framework for the study. On 126, they talk about the idea of questions, right? And they talk about prompts and probes. And about the idea that we should start with the easiest and least upsetting questions. You want to make it easy for them to get started. It's also okay to start with some closed questions. Where are you from? That kind of thing. That is very easy and will help the person become comfortable talking with you. Sometimes we ask what's called a grand tour question, just very broadly sketching out the terrain. Prompts and probes are things that we ask with open questions. Prompts are, can you tell me about that, right? Tell me about whatever the topic is. Whereas probes are, can you clarify this? Can you tell me more? Would you please give me an example, right? And we try not to do what's called in court it'd be called leading the witness, or here it'd be called leading the participant. You want to try as much as you can to stay open and allow the person to answer in their own way rather than having them want to please you, right? Or at least not argue with you by staying open. So, for example, if you're studying athletes, college athletes, and you want to have a better understanding of how they deal with the pressure of being an athlete and being a full-time student, you could ask, didn't you expect that it would be difficult to balance sports and academics at SCU? But then you're clearly communicating to them that you expect them, that they should have expected, right? And that you fully expect them to think it was going to be difficult. If you ask that in a not leading way, you would instead say, what did you expect would happen when you were balancing? Or how did you think the experience of balancing sports and academics would be? Or what expectations did you have when you arrived for balancing sports and academics, right? Another way of looking at that, if it was a probe, is you might say something like, wow, you sound angry about the way your supervisor treated you. But sometimes there's an intensity and you that's not anger, and you don't want to necessarily label the emotion for the person, because then again, they have to either disagree with you or they have to, push back. And so ideally what could say instead is, how do you feel about the way your supervisor treated you? Or how would you describe your reaction to how your supervisor treated you, right? So as much as you can, you want to not lead your participant towards specific language. On 128, they clarify again that the purpose of interviewing is to elicit narratives and meanings, and that this requires flexibility. This can be rather tough with the IRB. And we talked about the Institutional Review Board, and we talked about ethics. They're the ones who have to approve your proposal before you can get started, and they always want a full list of your questions. However, we're going to be doing semi-structured interviewing in this class, meaning we're going to have a list of questions, but we're going to feel free to have prompts and probes to follow up with people on what they said and ask them to clarify, to give examples, to say some more about it, or if they say something you didn't expect, to just sort of follow that line, to go with them as they ask about those things. And this is not unethical at all, but it can be a challenge to get through the IRB in terms of giving them examples of where you're going and what you expect to have happen, right? But you can't always predict completely. Okay. On 129, they talk about the idea that you can interview with just one person, or you can interview what's called a dyad, meaning two people. So there's three people, you and two people, or you and three people even. And that those, so you can do a dyad, just you and the other person, or a triad, meaning you and two other people. You can also interview couples, which would also be an example of a triad. And couples who are a couple themselves, like dating or living together or perhaps married, right? Those kinds of things, or maybe it's like a supervisor and the person that they supervise, right? Or best friends. cross-sex friends, right? You can have a couple, people who are already paired up in some way that you interview. And these are all good and all different. You're going to get a very different interview if you interview two spouses together than if you interview them separately. And that's not good or bad, it's just very different. Okay. Um, they also talk up here about focus groups, right? And the idea that you can have a group that you're talking to. Focus groups have become very popular. They're a good way in which you can actually make a living with what you're learning in this class. Marketing and advertising use these. Politics, people who are developing films run focus groups in order to understand their perspectives. All different kinds of ways in which focus groups get used. These are groups of people and are hence more efficient. People act differently as well in one-on-one groups than they one-on-one interviews than they do in groups, and that is not, again, a bad thing or a good thing, but sometimes you get some things from having people interact with each other in a focus group that you lead while they get to interact with each other rather than talking to people one-on-one. This can lead to some interesting sharing and comparing. Sampling respondents on 131, sampling respondents, or what we call participants, needs to be in a focus group. All the people who would be in a group, you don't want to go for lots of variation. So if you want to interview them about, for example, safe sex practices, you're generally speaking going to want to have all straight people or all queer people, or you're going to want to have all men or all women, or all people who don't fit into either of those categories, people who are gender fluid, gender nonconforming, transgender, those kinds of people could form another kind of group. But generally speaking, the more you mix it up, the harder it is for them to be a group that bounces off each other. So you might want a group that all work together, or a group of just nurses or just doctors, but it may be harder if you put nurses and doctors together. Okay, I'm going to stop there and we will continue on in the next video.